Dearly beloved, today happens to be the 6th anniversary of my first day at Montclair Presbyterian Church. And if you told me then that 6 years into the job I'd be giving up live worship services for Lent and would be preaching to a virtual congregation, I'd have looked at you as if you'd been reading too much dystopian science fiction. But here we are. Apparently, we have been cursed to live in interesting times. Had we been worshiping in our regular Sunday celebration today, we would have had a real treat. In lieu of a sermon, 5 writers from our congregation were going to share essays and poetry about climate change. And stay tuned for that, because we are going to reschedule their sermon for another Sunday once the state and the county give us the go-ahead for people over the age of 60 to gather in groups of more than 10. After church, we were going to have a class on climate change, a class organized and taught by members of our congregation who are climate scientists. It's a class that I hope would have inspired us to act, or rather, it's a class that I hope will inspire us to act, because the class also will be rescheduled to a later date, and hopefully it will be on the same date as the writer's sermon. Now, in the meantime, I want to move forward in this homily in the spirit of the writers and the scientists, because our writers and scientists are embodying the best of our faith tradition, because they are responding to the crisis of climate change with art and with fact-based action. Now, as you know, because you are watching this sermon on your computer rather than in the sanctuary, our world is facing the crisis of a pandemic right now, and it's scary, and it's sobering, and like all scary and sobering events, this pandemic demands of us a response. And I say that the pandemic demands a response because we have no choice but to respond. Even those who choose to ignore the seriousness of the COVID-19 virus, who will go about their days without the extra washing of hands, people who will rub their eyes before getting on public transportation and then pick their noses once they get off, even they are responding to the pandemic. Because even a dismissive and cavalier response is still a response. So the pandemic demands a response, and I think we need to be proactive in forging what our response will be. We need a response that is formed by faith and informed by the best information that science has to offer. And by the way, in our Presbyterian tradition, these are kind of the same thing. For 500 years now, our tradition has embraced scientific learning as faithful work. And I hope that tradition will carry us through this global health crisis. And I want to say that there is a great tradition of Christians responding positively in the face of pandemic, but unfortunately that hasn't always been the case. In Europe, during the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, Christians blamed Jews for the disease, and tens of thousands of Jews from all over Europe were murdered. Whole communities were wiped out because Christians responded to a pandemic with hatred and fear and ignorance, which are the exact opposite of what our response should be today. But the historic response to the various medieval European plagues wasn't always bad. In fact, there are some examples of responses that were truly faithful, and 2 of them can be found in 2 of my favorite places in Europe, places which actually are 2 of my favorite places in the world. And the first is in northern Italy, where I have some relatives who have been on my mind quite a lot recently. My relatives live in Lombardy, which is the epicenter of the Italian coronavirus scare crisis. And a couple of my Italian cousins are doctors, and some are pharmacists. It's fair to say that their life has been absolutely miserable for the last several weeks. And I hope you will join me in praying for my relatives in Italy and for the people in their town of Vigiù in Varese. But anyway, in the part of northern Lombardy where my relatives live, that part of Italy was ravaged by the plague early in the 17th century. And the legacy of that pandemic is an amazing tradition creation of public religious art, as if the local population poured out its spiritual longings, its hopes, and its fears through creative expression. There are beautiful roadside chapels in various places, and in the center of the region, where my family lives, there's a mountain called Sacramonte, or Holy Mountain, where during that plague in the 17th century, the locals made a place of pilgrimage. Now, probably the mountain had been a place of pilgrimage since before Christianity even existed. But during the first part of the 17th century, it was reimagined and it was rebuilt during this series of great plagues. And today, it is profoundly beautiful. As you walk up the mountain to the church, you pass by small chapels, each with a different depiction of a scene from Jesus' life, so that the faithful, most of whom were illiterate at the time, could learn the stories of the gospel as they climbed the mountain to pray. It was wonderful, it was beautiful, it was a creative response to what must have been a season of tremendous and profound grief and fear. Now, on the other side of the Alps, about 100 years before that, when another plague was affecting the people of Geneva who were living through the tender years of the Reformation, the first thing the church did in the face of the plague was to make sure that those suffering from the illness had proper care, both medical care and spiritual care. They built a hospital, which as an institution anyway, still is operational today. And the clergy of the city committed themselves to visiting the sick and praying with them as they faced death. The other thing that the church in Geneva did was to lobby the city government to take measures that would improve the city's public health. The city put its sewers underground, and they took measures to ensure a safe supply of clean drinking water, and it helped. Geneva became the cleanest and healthiest city in Europe. It was a faithful response because it was compassionate and based on the best science available to them at the time. Now, part of why I believe the artistic response to the plague in Lombardy and the compassionate scientific response in Geneva are faithful responses is that they reflect the creativity of the God who, according to the Bible's creation narratives, moved over the waters of chaos and drew forth light and life in all of its beauty and goodness. And part of the witness of the Bible's creation myth is this: we were created in the image of the God who creates. Like God, we are meant to draw beauty from chaos. And if this current pandemic has felt like an overwhelming flood of uncertainty, perhaps even chaos, then, dearly beloved, our response should be a godly response. We should do what we can to draw forth beauty and to act in ways that are well informed. Now, if you're an artist, let the bizarre energy of this season inspire you to create. I want to see your poetry. I want to read your poetry and your stories. I want to see your paintings and your photography. I want to listen to the music that you create in the coming weeks and months. And if you're a caregiver of any kind, please respond with compassion that is well informed. In fact, whoever you are, please respond with compassion that is well informed. Reach out to people who are lonely. Dial a number, send a postcard, whatever. No one should feel isolated, and no one has to feel isolated. The telephone is old technology. Heck, even email is old technology now. We can still and always be community for each other. And don't be afraid. Take necessary precautions. Wash your hands, avoid random handshakes, stay away from large groups, especially if you're over the age of 60 or you have health concerns. But keep looking forward. The virus will do what it is going to do in the world, but the pandemic will pass and life will go on. And maybe, just maybe, we will be better as a people because as a people, we will have responded faithfully, beautifully, compassionately, and with good information. Maybe this season of pandemic will inspire great art. Maybe the next great American novel will be written from quarantine, just as George Orwell wrote 1984 isolated and recovering from illness in Scotland. Maybe all the social distancing that's going on will teach us to use technology to make sure no one is lonely, even when the stores are once again well supplied with toilet paper and hand sanitizer. And there's a lot of information floating around the internet right now, giving advice, telling stories about COVID-19 virus. Some of that information is good, and some of it is bogus. Maybe we'll emerge from this crisis with a better awareness of how to separate the wheat of truth from the chaff of malarkey. Maybe we'll enter into a season of political discourse in which the common good is more important than partisan advantage. Maybe our leaders will learn to respond to various crises in ways that are informed and intelligent rather than compulsive and concerned primarily with political fallout, which is to say, maybe the folks in Washington will learn what leaders in cities and counties and states are doing all across this country. My prayer is that the same Spirit who blew over the waters of creation, bringing forth order and beauty, my prayer is that same Spirit will blow over us, inspiring us to respond to this crisis in ways that bring beauty and compassion, responses that are informed by good science or just common sense. Now is not a time for fear. Now is not a time to turn on one another. Now is not a time to repeat the horrific mistakes of the past by scapegoating and by deepening our divisions. Now is a time to do beautiful things, even in isolation. Now is a time for compassion, even if we have to learn new ways to express that compassion. Now is a time for science and to put that learning, now is a time to learn from science and to put that learning into practice, even when it means shifting through all sorts of information, some of which may be unhelpful. Let's do this. Let's emerge from this time of pandemic a better, stronger, more resilient people. People who have made the world more beautiful and more healthy for all of God's tender children.